Hello, and welcome to my show. My name is Bret. This is the internet, and you're watching me on YouTube. At least you should be. Hopefully you're live, and this isn't something you're watching later, because the whole reason we're doing this on Thursdays every week is so that you can hang out, ask questions of my guests, and hopefully get some good answers. Or maybe it's just me doing Q&A, and you get answers that way. Either way, you can help sponsor this show, support this show any way you like. We've landed on Patreon, so you can go over there, and you don't have to give me any money. You just click the follow button, and you get weekly updates on who's going to be on the show, what open source am I releasing, boring blog articles that I've written about DevOps or Kubernetes or something. You click the follow button, or you can sign up for one of our groups. The High Fivers group is coming up on its monthly hangout, where we basically sit in a Discord server and we talk shop. We do video, and it's kind of like just your average lunch hangout with friends in DevOps. So that's a kind of a fun thing, because we basically get up to a dozen people usually show up, and we just talk about the projects we're working on, and we hang out for an hour or so. So you can join that through the High Fivers Club there for $5 a month. All right, so let's get to it. I'm excited to have some guests on the show from all over the internet. So we've got in the middle, we've got Jamie, and on the right, we've got John. He's the Cloud Level Midnight. Fantastic little play on The Office, which we were talking about before we went live. And welcome.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
So let me give a quick introduction real quick, so these guys don't have to talk about themselves forever. So in the middle there, we've got Jamie, and of course, both of these gentlemen have been around the container industry since Docker or before Docker, right? Like before it was called even a container. But Jamie over there is, sorry, we're talking about Jamie in the middle. He's been working on containers since they were called sandboxes, which maybe we'll get into later. And when Kubernetes was written in Python back in its original form. So he's an ops person that has been doing stuff now at Google as a customer engineer. What is that about?
Yep. So I'm the nerd the sales guy calls when they need to keep all of the customers' nerds calm and happy.
Nice.
Been doing that for quite a while. It's a fun interface for when you're a geek who likes to communicate. That pre-sales technical role is a fun one.
Yeah.
That I've discovered.
Yeah, teaching and training, I imagine. A lot of talking. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of it. A whole lot of let's explain, like we were talking about before, let's explain containers for the 36th time this month. I distinctly remember saying to John, like in 2019, like we can throw out the containers 101 talk. Like we're done, right? Everyone knows. And
right. The world's been saturated.
You gotta keep it, because you're gonna get that one meeting where it's like, what is containers?
Right. Oh, there are laggards. That's why we have that word, because there are many of them.
Yeah, could roll out of bed at 3 a.m. and give that talk.
Yeah. And on the right over there, on the right over there, we have John Osborne from Red Hat. Are you both East Coast?
Yes.
I'm Tysons Corner, Virginia right now, just about 12 miles outside DC. So.
Nice.
Yeah, and I'm in Raleigh in the Triangle.
So the three of us are within a half a day's drive, because I'm in Virginia Beach, which is pretty rare on this show to have two guests and us all be within an afternoon of each other, as long as traffic obeys. John is a chief architect at Red Hat, and the reason I got these two people on the show is a while ago they wrote a book, OpenShift in Action. So they talked about OpenShift for an entire book.
And yeah, the first thing that popped in my head was when we had to pick the picture for the front. Man, you know how O'Reilly does all of the animal, like everything has an animal, and Manning does art. They were an art book company back in the day, and that woman was the least creepy of the three.
Yeah, we had three options. We were just like, let's go with the least creepiest of all of them.
Yeah, we went with least creepy.
It's still a little creepy though.
She's still, that's what I'm saying. She's still pretty creepy. But
yeah.
There was one that you're like, oh my God, like that's unsafe in every way you could think about it.
I don't know. Sometimes creepy sells though. Like, this book is haunting me.
The chapter on C group still haunts me from time to time.
So, all right, people that are in chat, I'm seeing some chat from Biker. I'll read that in a second. Get your questions in early on anything related to basically, we're going to focus on Kubernetes, but specifically like large, complex deployments of Kubernetes. I think I probably am the least experienced in this team of three, even though I feel like I have had a lot of the battle scars from a top accounting firm to multinational security companies, but I don't do it full time. Never really have. It's always been sort of a part-time gig for me in the background as this stuff has happened. So I'm always looking to learn from other experts, and we could talk for hours about this. So I want to get your questions answered, so make sure you get those in early in the chat. So you both started with OpenShift years ago, or you were at least interested enough in OpenShift to write a book about it. What is that book gonna get an update? What's the plan?
Yeah, we get that a lot. Well, with Jamie at Google right now, probably not getting an update.
Probably
also,
not. Yeah.
Yeah. Our spouses were also very upset with us by the time the book was done. At least mine was, because it took a lot of hours. So yeah, probably not getting an update real soon.
Yeah, the biggest we burned a lot of family capital to get the book done. Because John didn't travel as much as I did, but I had a 1-year-old and did 100 nights in hotels for the year that we wrote that book, and there was not a whole lot of version 2 of the book may come at exception of my marriage.
Yeah, that's pretty much the sentiment I get of all technical book authors.
Yeah. Everyone I've ever talked to. Yeah.
The only ones that I know that are successful long term are the ones that for some reason love writing books. Like either that or they feel so obligated because they wrote something and they have to keep it up to date. There's a gentleman, Nigel Poulton, that writes a Kubernetes book, and he updates it every year religiously, and I just can't imagine. It sounds like it's rewriting a book.
Easier. I mean, like one of the big time things, especially the first one, is like, Manning has a very specific learning style and a very specific way to write, but not only big picture, like even very implementation wise, like they want you to say like can't instead of cannot and things like that. And so I think when you write the first book, there's just a lot of rework too. It's not like we just sit down and write a chapter and then we're like, that looks good, let's just do some correcting. Like a lot of the chapters got rewritten many times. So
Oh yeah. A lot of rework.
Yeah. And that teaching style was so specific that, and when we were talking about before you went live, it has completely changed the way I communicate. Any kind of technical concept, like the way I think about explaining things has changed since doing this book in 2018.
Yeah.
But man, it was a boot camp I do not look to replicate.
Yeah.
Well, I know that
it taught us a lot about simplification, I'd say. I mean, Jamie was talking about guys still think about it when I do presentations for customers and so forth. It's like, I think if you looked at a presentation I did from 4 or 5 years ago, there'd be at least twice, maybe 3 times more slides than there needed to be, and probably 3 times more technical detail than there needed to be. And I think the learning style is a lot about reinforcement and simplification and things like that, and actually doing. And so, just learned a lot that really helps kind of convey technical concepts and details a lot better, I think.
Yeah, that's something I'm still continuing to hone at all times, because when you decide to actually teach others, and that just really is a leadership role. By the way, a friend of mine, for those of you listening, a friend of mine, if you're a technical leader or a team leader for developers, a friend of mine is actually creating a cohort-based course for technical leaders, Laura Taco. She's actually run some big engineering teams at CloudBees and CodeShip and a bunch of other companies. So for those interested, pay attention on Twitter in the next 5 hours, because I'm related to teaching. All management jobs are teaching jobs, in my opinion. Like, your job is to mentor people and help them be better than you. So I'm excited that someone's putting together an actual course for technical leaders, because a lot of us, we all get put into positions of leadership, and we're like, well, I was a good engineer, so how does that make me a good leader? All right. I want to get into some questions around specifics of some of these distributions. And since I'm going to throw you under the bus, John, what with OpenShift what is it about OpenShift that would make me want to use it over another distribution? I mean, I've never used it in a production environment, so I'm actually asking for myself selfishly. People ask me all the time, like, why OpenShift? And I don't really have a good answer other than Google it.
Yeah, so right now, the book itself, it's based on OpenShift 3. OpenShift now is version 4. And I think in the 3 days, it really was, where we were saying it's like Enterprise Kubernetes, that was like the big thing. It was like we were taking Kubernetes, adding a bunch of security defaults and other things that make it more usable, other pieces that you would need, packaging that up, the logging, the metrics, and so forth. Now with 4, really it's, the one sentence headline I'd say is it's a, turnkey platform. So we made a couple really big architectural decisions that vary from 3 to 4. So probably the biggest one is now that the source of truth comes from the cluster. So if you kind of look at a lot of enterprise Kubernetes distributions, including OpenShift 3, is based around a lot of traditional ways of rolling out software. So for instance, with OpenShift 3, we actually had all these Ansible playbooks that would go install OpenShift for you. And they had, I think, over 2,000 ways you could configure them. And of course, you could configure the kubelet anyway and all those things. And they
I have a stabbing pain behind my eyes now thinking about this playbook.
Yeah, bringing you flashbacks. And so for 4, we really built everything around Kubernetes and the operator framework. So everything is if you're not familiar with the operator framework, it's basically a software extension mechanism for Kubernetes, and it builds on the declarative way of doing things where it says, I want this basically, and then just goes and makes it happen for you. And we really built everything that way, including the operating system. So even now, like Red Hat CoreOS, which is our semi-immutable distribution of RHEL, like even that's an implementation detail of the cluster. So when you go to upgrade OpenShift, everything updates for you, including the OS and just an implementation detail like the logging and the metrics and so forth. But so that's really it. It's meant to be kind of a turnkey, autonomous, kind of self-correcting platform, and just really everything is kind of installed through operators and in a consistent way that'll just run anywhere. So right now we're focusing a lot on edge and kind of going to some smaller deployments, and managed services also is small for us, but it's our fastest growing segment. So we're really kind of preparing to transition to that, which is a lot. There's so much more that goes into that than which is Jamie knows because now he's at Google also. But there's just it's a lot less technical and a lot more organizational. How you have to move towards managed services, where it's like this is your messaging. This is where you're going to help the customer. You're focusing more on the workloads and porting them over and things like that than actually. Because now everything's more turnkey, so it's less about it's getting everything up and running, and it's more about let's just start moving workloads onto the platform and all those things. So
right,
that's a lot of what we're focused on right now.
Interesting. Is there one thing I'm curious about, and I assume that OpenShift has? Is there a sort of a multi-cluster, single pane of glass kind of approach with the,
so
with the tooling?
We have something called, I hate the acronym because people pronounce it RACM, but it's basically Red Hat Advanced Cluster Manager. So it's IBM basically gifted us, and we're either in the process or have open sourced it with their multi-cluster management tooling. But so we're focused on that for multi-cluster deployments, which is becoming really big for us. And we've built a lot of the GitOps stuff that we're doing and some of the policy and security pieces into Advanced Cluster Manager. So the idea is like you can provision clusters right from there, and they're going to meet your compliance aspects that you need, and they're going to be set up with GitOps if you have a lot of clusters. I've worked with a few retail customers, and even some things that you really wouldn't expect. Like I've worked with gas stations and stuff where they're like, "Hey, we got like 3,000 stores," and the gas station attendant is not a Kubernetes expert, so
right.
It needs to be
turns out.
and things like that. So,
or maybe they are in 2022. Who knows?
Yeah. Maybe they took the Linux Academy course or something.
Yeah. The often, I mean, when I'm the one that's usually getting involved with customers on their first couple of clusters, and getting them that workflow that's repeatable, and trying to, because I often talk about Kubernetes being unopinionated, and you can use it in all sorts of right and wrong ways, and I think a lot of us all now are like exclusively declarative, trying to do everything declarative, get ops, all the things and all that. So often it's the challenges that they run into that I can't easily help with is scaling problems, right? Like they did all this for one app and in a couple of clusters, but how do they have 50 clusters, like you're saying, in gas stations and in small little environments or in disaster scenarios and stuff like that? And I'm always interested in those. This new series of tools, I say newer than Kubernetes itself, set of tools that allow us to manage and deploy clusters as easily as we deploy containers. So that's good. Rackham, right?
Yeah,
Rackham. I hadn't heard that one before, John. Rackham is rough. Like that. That's hard.
Yeah, it's not great, but the technology is great, but the acronym's not great. But
yeah,
once you start moving up the stack and you start doing some of these things like automation stuff, it's not as exciting because it becomes a lot less of technical, especially in enterprise and larger organizations. It becomes a lot less of technical problems that you're solving and a little bit more around alignment. And a lot of large organizations, especially if they've been around, they have a very fixed mindset towards things like risk and compliance and so forth. And so you're trying to meet kind of these new ways of working and there ends up to be a lot of people discussions and things that you have, and it's not all tech at a certain scale. I don't know what that scale is, but I'm in it. So
you found that you found that problem.
Yeah.
Well, before we get any more into it, I actually want to sort of counter this because Jamie is working at Google, and I wanted to just talk about Anthos for a second, and because I'm actually not familiar with this product. So what's the elevator pitch?
So the one that is the thing that comes off of like slide 4 that you would get from a Google sales rep about Anthos isn't what I call the elevator pitch. The thing and I've been at Google not quite 2 years. It'll be 2 years this summer. And the thing that astounds me more than anything about Google Cloud is that we sell the things we use. So Cloud Spanner, which is this giant globally available relational database with ridiculous statistics, inside Google, it's just called Spanner. And it's the database that drives Gmail. And cloud storage, well, is just a very thin, is the storage that drives Google Drive. And so we take these things and we build them internally to solve our problems. And then we say, oh, there's value in that. So then we figure out a way to present it out to customers for them to consume. All the way down to the AI algorithms that we use for the Pixel phone lines. Those algorithms that make sure the transistors are all on the board and make sure there's no dents or scuffs on the phone coming off the line are available as a product that you can go and build your own algorithms around. So all of that to say is what Anthos is to me, and it is our multi-hybrid cloud, blah, 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 the way you have one ops control plane to do all of the Kubernetes everywhere. But what it is to me is that we took all of that institutional knowledge inside Google about doing ridiculous amounts of work at ridiculous scales that no one else has. We locked a bunch of engineers into a room with a whole bunch of pizza and Mountain Dew and said, figure out enterprise architecture for the next 5 to 10 years. What came out the other end was Anthos. So it is Google's take on what enterprise computing should look like in a multi-hybrid cloud environment for the next 5 or 10 years. And it's very googly. Like it has its own, like when you go interfacing with it, it feels like you're dealing with Google a little bit. And some people have that learning curve where they're used to other things and they're used to just sort of enterprise workflows. And a lot of the workflows aren't very enterprisey. It's very Google centric, which I find comforting now, but I've also got, almost 2 years of learning curve to make me comfortable with.
Right. And that's the thing about
the way we think enterprise is going to be.
Okay. And we got of course the questions we always get, like one versus, and that's fair because we've all got to make a choice at the end of the day. But I'm going to try to save you all from it and say when choosing Anthos, Tanzu, OpenShift for Kubernetes, I'm just going to say, what's your ecosystem, and save these two gentlemen the expectation of aligning with their company, which they should do.
Or saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Saying that exact same thing in a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
if you're not in Google.
Like at Red Hat, I do a lot of the competitive customer meetings, but I would say like most of our engagements are not, there's not bake-offs or competitive. It's like just building momentum and inertia and helping customers port the workloads over and helping solve some of their technical challenges and business problems and so forth. But it's usually not like, hey, we have to compare distributions and platforms and so forth. There's
occasionally,
but
I do remember doing that a lot, like 2015, 2016. Kubernetes was early days. Docker Enterprise, or whatever it was called back then, was beta. We were all still looking at Mesos. Like, is that the contender that we all should be looking at? And I can see like those early days, but I mean, from us insiders' point of view, it's not like OpenShift isn't going to be here in 5 years, right? Or it's not like Google's going to go away in 5 years.
Right.
So
yeah, I think like a lot of customers now, they make decisions that are, aligned with their values a lot more, because you're essentially like placing bets on technology, because 5 years ago or 6 years ago, that what you're talking about was the default way to buy enterprise software. You could look at Gartner or something, because and people look for spreadsheets of, do you support this versus that? But when you're investing in technology now, I think it's just the iterations going so quickly that the spreadsheets are going to be thrown out next year. So why look at features? You're kind of placing more bets on where you think this is going to be and iterate to in the future. So
yeah.
Hey, Kamaraju's his question, or I'm assuming his. So Kamaraju, your question, it kind of has two levels. There's kind of two forks in that road, because there is a pretty clear decision. If I'm going to do like DIY Kubernetes, if I'm going to roll my own Kubernetes distribution versus use one of the vendor supplied and off the shelf tool set, I have to decide whether my business problem needs me to be a creator of that technology or a consumer of that technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to make that decision. I got to make that decision pretty early. There are use cases where I need to create an incredibly customized Kubernetes environment or incredibly customized whatever environment to fulfill my business needs. Those use cases are incredibly rare, and I promise you almost never work on them. Like your data is what's unique. Your problems are incredibly common. So once you decide that, and you find yourself looking at all the different Kubernetes distributions, you can succeed with all of them. Like I've kind of got the Kubernetes EGOT here. Like I've worked on OpenShift and Tanzu and Anthos. You can do all of them at scale and find success. The trick becomes taking the skills that you have in your group and putting them into play. If I've got if I have a crack team of VMware superstars, using Anthos doesn't make a lot of sense because they're all starting from scratch. Whereas they could absorb the workflows in Tanzu way faster to find success.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point. So like we get a lot of customers, and I'm sure you do too, where it's like there's these platforms like OpenShift is very holistic now. It does a lot of things, but it doesn't do everything, right? And so sometimes there's partners that come in to do things like we did acquire StackRox, but say there's a lot of partners that do container scanning and might be a Cerberus mesh overlay or one of these things that do some of these other kind of fill in some of these gaps. And customers will ask me, okay, well, which one should I choose? And like, I tell them, like, you really need to choose the one that's really going to partner with you and work at your cadence, and like ignore yes, you might have minimum technical requirements. It needs to meet those, but like, don't look for some golden feature. Look for the people who are really going to partner you and kind of move with you and help you move along.
Yeah, if you're one of my customers that has been on GCP for a while and you're consuming it and your ops teams have that skill set, Anthos is going to feel great because it's going to use the verbs and the nouns and the concepts that you're already used to. And you can spin up Anthos in 20 minutes across 4 different places and get there and have this incredible solution that's up and ready to roll. But if we're gonna spend the first 20 minutes of the phone call talking about what G Cloud is, you're not ready. and that's when it's time to look at other ideas, if that's in your timeline. So yeah, so it's not choosing. Like you said, like 2016, 2017 is like which one's best, and we're all sort of fighting for that turf war.
Yeah.
Right.
Now it's like which one's best for this situation. Like find success. Use your skills to find success. You can get there with all of them these days. Just hopefully none of my sales reps are listening in.
Well, and that's the thing too, is there's no reason why you can't have both. And in a large enough organization, you're probably got multiple teams that are choosing their own path. And I mean, I was recently working with a very large international bank, and they have a very clear path for anything they onboard into Kubernetes. And it actually made me happy because I as an implementer of random technology for random companies, we have dealt with, for 30 years, I've been trying to find something that was at least standardized. And that's why what gravitated me to Docker in the first place was I saw an opportunity for a universal packaging and distribution system that we had never had before in ops, right? And I came from that sysadmin background. So it spoke a lot to me. And then Kubernetes was the potential for that scenario to work at another layer of abstraction, even beyond that, and that we could all start describing, and you're talking about moving workloads, right? Like before Kubernetes, moving a workload from a data center to the cloud, like there was so much complexity. There were so many.
You were sacrificing goats. Yeah.
Yeah.
You needed like 2 pounds of duck feathers and a voodoo doll. Like, it was crazy.
I mean, I still, a lot of organizations, they still try to copy their on-premise stuff into the cloud. So it's like they're still hung up on like IP whitelisting and things like that. So, you get into where it's like, well, our LDAP has, 400 roles. So we're just going to forklift those 400 roles over. And that's how we're going to do identity management and things like that. So there's I think one of the interesting things about Kubernetes is as customers have moved to containers and Kubernetes in general, it's a good time to do a lot of things that you weren't doing before. And, customers always try to find that balance of, well, I can build a better CI/CD pipeline. I can do cloud better. I can do these things, but I also need to deliver on something too. And, find the balance between those two.
Yeah. It is a great opportunity to lay some rocks down that you've been carrying for so long that you forgot you're carrying them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
they move over an old Java app and they're like, well, what do I do with this bash script that restarts the server every night? And it's like, you can throw it out. Throw it in the trash.
RM-RF.
Yeah, which is, I mean, that's the kind of thing where you deal with these implementation projects, and especially I would call like container conversions, or Dockerizing is what we used to call it, right? And it's, I always go looking for the easiest app first, because I know that there's going to be 40 things that we didn't know until the project is in the middle of the project. And suddenly it's like that. It's, well, that thing's got a memory leak, so we just have a cron job that restarts it every night, but only on that one server. That's the server it restarts on. And, so how do we do that in Kubernetes? Like there's that question comes up for every scenario, possible. Well, these 3 containers that are completely unrelated, all need to share and read and write to the same directory. So how do we do that in Kubernetes, right? And
that's always the fun stuff.
And I think. So let me give you this to start with, and you're gonna rant on this for a minute, and I hope you do, because I want you to soapbox this. On projects now, I consider any new project, they're probably laggards. Because if they're just now doing Kubernetes, some of them are just now doing Docker. They're, we're 8 years in on this evolution, and they're just now getting to it. So to me, they're going to have all the problems of, we don't know what 12-factor is, we don't know what distributed design is, and Kubernetes, like you're saying, you don't need Kubernetes yet. You need to catch up from 10 to 15 years of the evolution of computing, essentially. Give me some hot takes on that scenario.
So Red Hat's behind 2 fundamental platforms, and I've told some customers the other platform is Ansible, and I've told customers like you really should be moving more towards Ansible right now. And then once you get better hygiene around, because a lot of customers, if they're really legacy, they actually don't even know how to rebuild their virtual machine because they've just been maintaining it and taking snapshots and doing all those things. So they don't even know where to start with the Docker files. So in that case, I've recommended that they move to something like Ansible, and then maybe even Ansible with containers as kind of like a middle ground. And then you slowly, once you kind of build those better practices, then better hygiene, source control, all those things, more automation, then in the future you'll be more ready to move to something like Kubernetes.
Yeah. You're going to pay for it at some point. Like there is a fixed cost for doing that sort of advancement. And John's dead on. You can't. Kubernetes requires you to define your infrastructure in software. You're abstracting your infrastructure, and figuring out how to talk to it through an API. That's what Kubernetes does. If you don't know what your processes are, you sure as hell can't automate them away. So figuring out that Ansible middle ground is that automation step. Figuring out what my processes are so I can then automate them, so I can then abstract them into the Kubernetes API. Sometimes, they've got budget to do X and they don't have budget to do Y. I mean, you're going to pay for it one way or the other. You pay for it in time and go through, like John said, and let's evolve and figure out how to fast forward the evolutionary process. Or you pay for it with, people and pain to get there. Right. You're going to pay one of them. What is, good, fast, and cheap? You can have any two.
You can have two, right?
And that's exactly where there's so many customers. I think we talked to them 2 days ago. They are an old OpenShift 3 customer, point of fact. And in OpenShift 3, there is a thing where you can, before a workflow kicks off, or it may be, I think it's in OpenShift 4 too, there's a pre-hook. So before I start this thing, I can run a pre-hook to do a thing. And it exists because OpenShift existed before init containers. Where now, if I were designing that, I would put some logic in my init container to decide whether or not to fire this stuff off. And it was all database priming. It was pumping, filling database updates and stuff. Well, there they sat. They'd been using these pre-hooks, and it's a very simplistic logic, but it's also very not cloud native because the logic's not inside the container. I'm not codifying the logic inside the binary. I've got some external source that's part of a kind of this weird limbo between CI and deployment. But it's very easy for them because they've been doing it for 5 or 6 years. And so I sat and explained to them, this is how init containers work. This is why you need to do them. Here's how you stop it from happening 10 times in a row with a simple lock file or something on your database. Right. And they listened and they understood. And then they still asked for the pre-hook feature.
I think it is. So it's actually part of the OCI spec, the pre-hook stuff, but I think it did get deprecated at some point.
And this was in a deployment tool context. This wasn't in a Kubernetes context.
Is this Helm, by the way?
No.
Because Helm has pre-hooks.
Yeah, this is actually coming out of Cloud Build and into Google's new tool, Cloud Deploy. They want to use Cloud Deploy, but it doesn't leverage the pre-hooks for Cloud that Cloud Build uses.
Right.
But neither here nor there. But they were faced with time or pain or money. Those are the 3 axes of pain that they had to deal with. And instead, they wanted the vendor to twist the metal around and make it do their old thing.
Right.
And we're like, well, sometimes it's a valid path. So they were asking the vendor to pay for the pain. And for our engineers to go solve the problem so they didn't have to get to a more cloud native world.
Well,
a long conversation.
That's an extremely common problem, I find. Every one of the projects I've been on is usually some legacy monolith app. Rails is, great example because it always has database migrations built in, and there's tooling built in for database migrations. And this is actually a very specific discussion on a very specific feature, but I am interested in a universal approach to this because what's weird right now is all of these tools that are developer focused, package managers. You could argue that the Rails stuff actually has some implementation. It has built-in migrations. It actually is concerned about deployment and building in and of itself. It's amazing to me that we're in 2022 and how many of these tools have basically tried to ignore Kubernetes or anything in containers. Like they maybe have a recommended Docker file, but that's about as far as they go for developers, which is weird to me because it's almost like those tools should be the ones adopting all this cloud native ideas. Like, to me, Rails should know about this stuff, be built in, and automatically lock when it's running, so that you could have 20 pods all potentially doing init containers, and there wouldn't be any conflicts or doubling up of effort on the SQL database or whatever. But I don't know that that's all built in, because I feel like these people's attitudes are just, it's your problem. You're the ops person. We're the developer.
Yeah. Right. And the Kubernetes, containers were this developer revolution that just gave the ops teams 4 new artifacts to deal with. And they're like, well, go figure out how to deal with it at scale. It works great on my laptop with nobody else around. Now figure out how to scale it up to 10 million users a day. Go for it.
Right.
And it is very much an evolutionary process. And like, it always blows my mind.
So this question is kind of, I think I know what all our answers are going to be, but how long do you think the container technology will stand in the industry? What is everyone wants to talk about what's after containers, what's post containers. I don't like serverless is the answer, because to me, serverless is greenfield only. So I always answer with, there is no future. We don't know the future. It's just containers and proxies all the way down. So do you have better answers?
I like the idea of serverless.
Slightly more optimistic view, but
so I like the idea of serverless built on containers, and in a lot of ways too. Like, I've worked with customers where it's like they want to modernize, and it's like, well, they can actually use serverless to modernize, because they might have something that runs once a day, right? And that used to be this batch workload type of thing, and now it can be more event driven, or they're provisioning infrastructure to run just for that one day, right? And now they can have something more event driven that spins up, spins back down, leverage Knative, those types of things. I think, like, in general with serverless, one of the things that it really hasn't promised on is like the idea that you only write business logic. Like, in practice, a lot of to date, a lot of serverless workloads, there is a lot of glue code that you have to write. But I'm pretty excited about the Cloud Events project, if you've seen that, where it's like, they're still iterating, but it's the idea is like, I can catch an event in a very non technology specific way, like a little bit more agnostic. So I can catch an event coming from Kafka, or I can catch an event coming from some log server. And the idea is, I'm not going to have to write custom code for each one of those things, like you would if you were in, Lambda, for instance, and you wanted to connect to Kinesis or Redshift or something like that. So,
yeah, you mentioned that. Sorry, real quick. You mentioned that Cloud Events. Is that a project?
Yeah, that's a part of. It's under the Knative CNCF stuff. I don't know if it's officially hosted by CNCF, but yeah, it's a lot of the same people iterating on those.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I read something about it recently, and now I can't recall what it was. So yeah. Okay, sorry. Cool. Jamie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so I get to play with this candy store that is Google Cloud. So we have all of these things. So I get to have a little broader perspective about, serverless. Serverless is a fork, is a tine on that pitchfork of getting stuff done. There are going to be workloads that are good fits for serverless platforms, and I take a little more abstract view there. There are going to be workloads that are good fits for mainframes. I try not to make that distinction a lot. I think most workloads now are good fits for Kubernetes, or good fit for containers, containerization, and that level of isolation. I would say, because Kubernetes is probably the least important, most critical thing there. I'm a huge fan. There's an old tweet from Joe Beda talking about Kubernetes as a toolbox. Kubernetes isn't the end product. And when I was at VMware, I was actually lucky enough. I was sitting across the table from Craig McCluskey. We were doing an executive briefing, and the customer asked him almost that exact same question: is like, what's after containers? What's after Kubernetes? And one of the people that helped create Kubernetes from the outset said the code base is the least important thing to Kube. It's not where the good ideas are going to stand the test of time. The thing that is the most important, the best idea in Kubernetes, is that you're speaking to your infrastructure through an API. That idea is the one that's here to stay. So that one, and it came from one of the guys that invented Kubernetes. So he doesn't care that it's written in Golang. He's not one of those fanboys wearing Gopher. Like he may care. Hell, I don't know. I know I don't. But none of that's the important stuff. Which features are available on the API server? Can HPA scale to 0? None of that's the important stuff. Those are implementation details that'll sort themselves as customers need them. The thing that's most important is that I'm now talking to my infrastructure through an API. That's where Kubernetes is going to stand the test of time. So to that question, that's not going anywhere.
Right.
That's only going to get more advanced and more nuanced. Containers
I had a
are
good quote too about Kubernetes helping move things from more ticket-driven IT infrastructure to API-driven, which and that's a big part of that, right? And Kubernetes is 2 million lines ago, right? Like no customer is going to adopt that. The real value of it is the API and the ecosystem. It's nobody's going to take on 2 million lines ago, right, and start maintaining it themselves. So just the fact that it's open source is not inherently valuable. It's the API and the ecosystem.
Yep. And so to that idea of what's next, I think something is next. We went from mainframes to the client server model to VMs to containers on this sort of evolutionary timeline of smaller Legos. We get better, more effective process isolation per square foot. I can fit more containers into a square foot of data center than I can a VM and into a physical server, into a mainframe. That's where it is. So there's going to be some sort of more efficient process isolation at some point in the future for our industry. It's an evolution. It's not an end state. Where that's coming from, no clue. Like there could be somebody at MIT or in Bangalore or in Butte County Community College. I don't know where, but there is some kid thinking up the next thing. Is it going to be microkernels? I don't know. Some people think that where I inject my application directly into the kernel. Okay, cool. Maybe. I don't know. I have no clue what the next thing is, but I know there is a next thing.
Yeah.
And I know that the value of it is, I want that next thing to be able to hide behind an API.
Mm-hmm. If you look at Kubernetes like 2-3 years ago, it was 3 million lines of code, and now it's 2, right? Because they built in all these interfaces like CRI and CNI to make it more pluggable. And now all the innovation really happens in the community. Like in the early days of Kube, you look at every minor release, you'd be like, oh, they get this feature finally added and this, and you'd follow it. Like I don't look at release notes of Kubernetes now because that's not where the fun stuff is happening. The fun stuff is happening in the ecosystem, right? It's Tecton, it's different software supply chain stuff, it's security, it's this service mesh and all those things, and that just kind of solve those problems, but are using that Kubernetes API. So I think that's pretty powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I think we probably all. So I think I have officially the most gray in this room. But so I have the scars to talk about like config DBs. Like that was the action. That was the hot thing 15 years ago.
Oh yeah.
The most amazing config DB. All my infrastructure, all in one database that's proprietary to some third-party tool. And it was rare unless it was from that vendor for any other tool to talk to that database. And we didn't think of APIs. We thought of the information's in a database, so you got to talk to the database. And we didn't think APIs. Because a lot of the operators and sysadmins that I know didn't formally come from a developer background. And I think that when we talk about jobs and the future and like where should people be focusing, people come to me all the time that had that sysadmin ops background, not traditionally trained in development, may know some scripting, right? It's kind of hard to have those jobs and not know scripting, but their job, they've never written a line of Go code. They might have, they know maybe a package manager or two, maybe one for Python, and they barely know it or whatever. Pip. And so
APIs were hard.
Yeah.
Like it took, days
when you had to make them yourself
to get something where I could run an API on it, much less know how to write an API for it.
Right.
And now it's, we could probably start a clock in the corner and all of us have a RESTful API up in under 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Somewhere. But APIs were hard. So, and it was expensive. That VM or that physical box was an expensive resource to run for an API for your config files. Screw that. Just talk to the database.
Yeah. Yeah. And every implementation back in the day was vendor specific, right? So every time you wanted to, and this is a point I wanted to make earlier and to maybe start a discussion that we've probably already covered, which was a lot of these enterprises, they still want to make decisions for a decade. So when they pick a product, they're thinking a decade out and how is this product going to mature over the decade? And all of us now, we're like, it's amazing if I get to use the same tool for 5 years. Like that's just incredible because things change so rapidly. So I don't even, to me, a decade is sort of almost a joke because, a decade ago, imagine a decade ago us predicting Kubernetes. Like, there's just no way. I don't know how anyone would have done it. Maybe in theory, but certainly not at a practical level or understanding the deployment or the scope of how everyone now is interested in it, and the whole industry is now determined. Kubernetes is on their front page, right? And there's this single tool which is not owned by any one vendor that they're all happening to go against. So I feel like it's this huge win, but at the same time, there's a great podcast recently on I think it's by Weave. It's their modern ops podcast. Okay. And they had some people on talking about Kubernetes adoption and some of the new, stuff that's come out about Kubernetes adoption percentages. And I never really thought of it this way, and that we're basically giving developers a menu of constraints, and that they have to fit in, like we're talking earlier about the init job. We're giving them these primitives, and we're saying, in all the world of software, you now need to fit your ideas into these constraints. And if you do, life is wonderful. It'll run everywhere, and it should just work. But if you truly want to go outside the lines, you're now going to be back where you were, which is very proprietary, very, very what's the word that we like to use in SRE? Tribal knowledge. Everything is very specific. There's that one person that knows how to touch that one server.
Nothing's ever documented.
Yeah.
I call it being hit by a bus compliant.
Yeah.
That is a thing.
Yeah.
So we've talked about two ways of doing enterprise Kubernetes. These are products, right? We mentioned two products really. But when you start looking at adoption of what are some of the other challenges that you're seeing your customers trying to adopt? I mean, obviously there's this huge gap. I think that's one of the big themes is there's this huge gap in knowledge from people just now adopting Kubernetes versus the people that adopted it 5 years ago, because they're just reading change logs, and new people have to basically learn the most advanced Kubernetes that ever was, which is the current version. And there's this huge gap in knowledge there. But what else other than knowledge gaps and like training? What else is there that you see? Is it all still people problems?
Yeah, people. I mentioned the fixed mindset towards risk. So the idea with that before was like, hey, when you were only on-prem and you knew exactly what the environment was going to look like, the environment wasn't dynamic. The idea was like, hey, I can go through some sort of risk management framework and do all my risk management, and then I can deploy it, and then it's going to run that way for a long time. And that's just not really valid in cloud, because cloud providers are iterating, the environment's dynamic, the workloads are coming and going, and so working with them towards, yes, I can be compliant, helping do some best practices and so forth, but let's look more at the monitoring aspect, the runtime, not just like baking everything up front, but like actually verifying that things are running a certain way. One of the big misconceptions a lot of customers have with cloud in general is around the shared security model, right? So there's been a lot of studies that they say 99% of breaches are based around misconfiguration, right? And a lot of customers don't necessarily have the skill sets that are there yet. So they're trying to automate and trying to do these things in a way that, like we talked about, kind of meets some of their on-premise things to make some of the security people happy, but also do it in a little bit more cloud-friendly way. You're focused on, the assets and not necessarily the perimeters and things like that you have on-premise. So it's kind of a culmination of all those things, and of course, building momentum and all those things that you need to get things out the door. But I think in the early days of Kube, one of the interesting things was you would set customers up with a cluster and so forth. Then they'd spend maybe 6 months trying to build out glue code for their own new CI/CD pipeline that they were going to do a lot way better than anything they had before and so forth. So we've been working with a lot of Red Hat's actually hired a bunch of people to build out some of that stuff for customers in the upstream. So that's one of the things is we're just trying to help people get their focus on their apps and not necessarily about connecting their proprietary storage or doing all those things. It's really just about making all the non-differentiated stuff go away, at least as much as possible.
I do think the people problem has changed. like you said, is it just a people problem, like the people's learning curves and like the problem 3 or 4 years ago, maybe before the end times, maybe before Corona, was how do I retain talent?
Mm.
And that's not exactly the problem anymore. That is still a problem, but people aren't even getting to that point.
Right.
Because amazingly, somehow the velocity of change of most of this sort of cutting edge, modern cloud native computing stack increased while we were all working in our basements. And now I'm running into lots of customers who are sort of the traditional fabric of the world, retail organizations, wholesalers, people that do various services things, but are 5, 10, 15 years ago, they could go find somebody, like you said, they were going to use a piece of technology for 10 years. It was going to, they were worrying about server depreciation, and they could
right.
find somebody who was their 9 to 5, and they would come in and their skill set would be valid for 5, 10, 20 years. Now they're trying to hire people and their skill sets aren't valid through the interview cycle.
Right.
And finding talent to execute these things, so they're kind of stuck in this catch-22 of, and I had a conversation with a customer about this 2 days ago, maybe 3. They have to use a modern tech stack. They have to adopt one, because if they say they're running Spring Boot on VMs, no one even applies to their jobs. So they have to use a more advanced cloud native stack. But then by the time they figure out which stack to use, the people that are in their hiring pipeline, like they've changed, like everything, like the ground is moving under their feet during the interview process.
I've had
literally
a few conversations with, especially if they're in San Francisco, something like that, where it's a similar problem. It's like you have to use Rust or whatever just to get people to apply, because people don't want to use the LAMP stack or whatever.
Right.
And I'm like, y'all just calm down a little bit. Like you can go solve a meaningful problem well with stuff that was around 6 months ago. Like you can do it. I promise. Like you don't have to be at the bloody edge of the knife 24/7. It sounds fun, but let's focus on the problem, not on the it's the same idea. Kubernetes focus. The value of Kubernetes is that it's an API for our infrastructure. It's not that it's written in Golang. I think the people problem is shifted. We need to keep our eye on that prize.
Yeah.
Let's worry about solving the problem. Let's not worry quite so. Let's solve the problem effectively and solve it where it'll stay solved. Not solve it with the coolest shiny object that I read about on GitHub 3 days ago.
Right. And there's certainly a ton of there's this thing that we all understand when we're involved with CNCF in some capacity, that there's just exhaustion of the projects, and there's just, it's open source, which means there's a new one every day. And it doesn't mean that CNCF puts it as an incubator every day, but it does mean that there's new stuff. If you stare at Twitter for more than an hour, you're going to find a new project you didn't know about. And so I like your approach to that, like talking about the people problem there, and hiring problem is obviously a huge thing. The thing that I do now with customers, and I don't know that I've really nailed it, but what I'm trying to get them over, like convincing them that this Kubernetes infrastructure is worth it in so many ways, and we can list all the benefits, and we talk about API infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things I really try to drive into the head of the managers is that like turnover is going to increase as the population matures, because younger people, I mean, I'm in my 40s, so I consider myself old at this point compared to most people in tech. And, people that are 20 are staying in the job a fraction of the time that I was. So I assume my team will rotate people, which means that the only sane way, other than focusing on a streamlined hiring process, is if I can build an environment. Kubernetes is one of the tools that would be used in there, but if I can build an environment that is what most modern, up-to-date companies are doing, regardless of the tool's name. Right, whether it's Docker building it or it's some other builder, whether it's a brand or a distribution of Kubernetes, doesn't really matter. But this idea of infrastructure as code, this idea of everything in Git, all infrastructure in Git, and I don't get to shell in the servers whenever I feel like, just because I want to change something, and driving that home with them, because my assumption is In 2 months, one of the DevOps people are going to leave, and they're going to have to hire a new person. And if they have all this tribal knowledge of bespoke design, and they made their own orchestrator with Bash, like, good for you. That's great. You're really smart people. But when you hire someone every other month or every month or every week, I mean, what is it? AWS has 30,000 job openings right now. Like,
not surprised.
I think 30-some thousand.
Emails from them every week at this point.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. I think their website said 30,200 and something the other day. And obviously they're not all engineer jobs, but the point here is like, I try to convince them that, look, if you're adopting these technologies, it's more how you implement them and the ideas that you're implementing that we've now adopted for the last decade around 12-factor DevOps and now, SRE and all that. If you're doing that, new people won't go, oh, that's how you do it. They will adopt to your flow pretty quickly because it's all in Git. They can all go look at it. The READMEs are filled out. That there's at least some basic documentation.
We block on docs.
Right. Yeah. I block on linting now. Like my big thing of 2021.
If I ever go out on a limb and do a thing on my own, like blocking on docs, I swear to God, that may be the company name.
Yeah.
Block on docs. That's actually
block on docs.
Go buy the domain. You said it on the internet, so you better go buy the domain.
I know, right? Quick. So now it's probably in the CNCF.
You got it.
Yeah, because there's now natural language parsers that will parse your doc and go, not really cutting it. I mean, have you heard of the Superlinter project? Because that's my thing of 2021 was Superlinter.
No, we just did a study at Red Hat, and the Kublinter was like the #1 open source tool that's being used right now for
KubeEval?
I forget which one. It was one of the Kube linting projects, but
it's KubeEval or Kube Conform, I think, is the newer one. KubeEval's Gareth, who was on the show a couple weeks ago, he invented that or created that project, and it's a little outdated. So we've had the Tree, which is now I think probably the best one right now. They were on the show like a month ago, and then Kube Conform, which is another open source project that basically is like a fork of KubeEval. Anyway, sorry, I've been into it recently, but linting. Let me just tell you, if you're watching the show and you haven't heard me talk about it 1,000 times, linting was always an optional thing, and it was always up to an individual developer to do it. But in recent years, linting, and automation has gotten easier. We got Git commit hooks. We got all these things we can do. But GitHub released, and specifically an individual at GitHub, which I need to have on the show, released a project called Superlinter, which it itself does not lint. It is a wrapper specifically for GitHub Actions around all the linters. So everyone, if you have a favorite linter, you commit it to the project. There's like 50 linters now. And it runs all the linters across your diffs in your PRs. And it's, like there's this much YAML to put it into every single one of your repos. And now GitHub just released reusable workflows. So for me, I put it in one repo on its own, and every other repo points to it. And so every PR on every repo is now linted on every language. And that's amazing. I want to block. I do. I'm not to that point yet, but I'm very close to saying we're blocking on linting. Like, yes, there's even a natural language linter that will complain on your markdown if you use repo, not repository. But still, if your team is rotating constantly, to me, linting is the only way to keep the code sane. Otherwise, you get 20 opinions.
You have to codify the knowledge. It's the only way you can survive.
About shifting left and all these things. Well, I mean, if you're really shifting left, like that's linting. I mean, in 2022 cloud native, right? You're checking on the developer station, you're checking those configuration files and those deployment files and those manifests and so forth. So,
have you looked at like fuzzing and stuff? Like the test case minimization and fuzzers and like sort of injecting AI into the test phase of a build?
No, tell me about it.
I've seen a couple companies that do that.
So there's I dropped a link into not into the public chat, but into the side chat. There's this thing called Half Empty, and like I've read it 4 or 5 times, and I understand if it's English, it's not a language. It's not the English I learned. But it's pretty slick. So my understanding of it, and it could be a completely wrong thing, is that in the test process, it's going to start doing fuzzing and it'll drop. It's kind of like Chaos Monkey in the test stage of your build.
Oh, that's interesting.
but localized to testing. So it'll do all sorts of crazy stuff to make sure you're like pretty. I have a customer that I worked with a little bit last year who's big on this of it. They brought it up to me. I didn't find it inside Google. It was from a customer.
Is it as good as I am at breaking things accidentally?
Let's not go crazy, John. I don't think anything like that is you're the Stradivarius of that. But
we all born with something, right?
Never seen it broken with more style than with John.
Yeah.
There
for the dramatic.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea, and it's just another angle of I've got customers that are injecting AI modeling into their build scenarios to sort of Selenium times 10. Right. Where they do all sorts of, not only just run through all the tests they can think of, but start figuring out new tests they can run and having the testing rig itself come up with some of those test cases.
Oh, okay.
Like, yeah.
I was going to say my challenge.
That's the thing. Like, I never thought the customer would do that.
Right.
Well, you can have a rough analog of a customer and not have 10,000 people pointing and clicking.
Is this something that would improve test coverage just by implementing it?
Maybe. No? I swear I don't understand this whole thing.
Okay. Because I mean, that's my core problem with customers.
I'm a failed history major. This is well beyond my CS background, but it's really cool. Like what little bit, like I kind of know in my gut, there's a lot of value sitting there. Don't quite comprehend what all the value is.
All right, we have a question for Jamie. How do you see KubeVirt and cross-plane technologies in the market?
I see them all over the market personally, and I know OpenShift is real bullish on KubeVirt these days with a couple of really big case studies. In my head, and again, it's all about convergence points, right? Like we are where we are now, and you've got auto scaling compute nodes, and you've got kube scaling. At some point in the near future, we want to, and for people that don't know, KubeVirt is a virtual machine running inside a container. So the libvirt process is running inside a container, which means I can now start and stop and query my virtual machine through the Kubernetes API. That idea of one scheduler to rule them all, we've been looking for in IT since we've had processes to isolate.
Yep.
And the Kubernetes scheduler is our best swing at it so far. Again, not putting any undue deference on the code itself, right. But it's a pluggable scheduler for workloads. The fewer of those I have in my infrastructure, the better my infrastructure is going to be. KubeVirt has some limitations, like if your VM, and it starts falling down in the corners, like with like NFV, like network stuff. Like if my VM needs 37 different disks and 49 different NICs attached to it on 14 different networks and all that weird stuff, KubeVirt gets hard fast because containers were designed to have a loopback and an ETH0.
Yeah.
But it's for most workloads, it works really well. I love the idea of fewer schedulers in my data center.
Yeah, that like with Crossplane and some of these other tools that are. It's the question is what comes first, the infrastructure or the Kubernetes? Because we have a self-referencing problem, and I don't have a good answer for it. I think the teams I've seen implement it, they basically have special repos that are bootstrap repos that they do infrastructure as code, but this is going to have to be run by an engineer manually on their machine or something. Right. Just to kick off
coming out of that, like assuming that smoking hole scenario of I've got to start from nothing. You've got to have a seed, and that seed, and if that seed is a hyper specialized Kubernetes instance that is designed to just spin up other stuff, that ain't a bad place to be. I mean, that's a pretty solid footprint for you to be able to rebuild from.
Yeah,
at least my take it is.
Red Hat's been working on a couple of technologies. So Kata containers is another analog to KubeVirt. That the main difference is that Kata containers is really like you have a container image, but you want another level of isolation. Mm-hmm. So you go in and you deploy a container, but it's essentially running in a VM as a container. And then KubeVirt is really for running those kind of traditional virtual machines on the cluster. It's a little bit more
VMware's
on-prem
solution,
because if you go in the cloud,
Tanzu's solution is similar to Kata, where it's a container running in a VM, whereas KubeVirt is a VM running in a container.
That's right.
Yep.
And with
KubeVirt,
VMware, it's a
Fearlet
little bit more on-premise, I would say, focused, because once you get into the cloud, you do kind of get this. I've got a VM on a VM situation, which can hurt performance, and in some cases isn't supported, depending on the architecture. But we've done some. If you work with a bank, the scale is ridiculous. You go in and they're like, hey, well, we just did a POC, and you're like, okay, so like 10 nodes, and they're like, it's like 80,000. It's just like it's kind of mind blowing sometimes. So
nobody has money like the people with money.
They've got money.
Yeah, it's insane. So I think eventually there's still a lot of rough edges out there. There's a lot of but fewer schedulers is better.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
I mean,
and it comes with some caveats, like you were saying, like how do I restart everything if everything was managed by a Kubernetes cluster?
Right.
Like you said, there's got to be some out of band something to get started with or to recover from. But
data center bootstrap.
Yeah, there's at some point there's a tape drive in the backseat of a Honda. At some point that's got to live somewhere.
All right, I know we're running long. I got 2 more questions for you from the audience. The first one from Martin. Enterprises tend to have centralized, for example, authentication authorization solutions for customers and employees. What would you advise enterprises moving forward in a Kubernetes world?
Yeah, so those are extremely sticky technologies. So I mean, it's very, very rare that a customer moves off their authentication and authorization technology. So normally it's like you're going to integrate those. Maybe in some way you're caching them or doing some other thing in front of it to meet some of your specs, but those are just so sticky and they've iterated over. Sometimes it's like migrating off of those. It's like, migrating off a mainframe or, an Oracle database from a 1990s app, right? It's a massive thing. And customers don't like to take on that kind of risk. So it's normally just an integration point or building around it if you needed to extend it.
Yeah. So this is where I'm going to plug Google Cloud. So I haven't really done it, but until now, but that's a place where it's really interesting. Like number one, you got to have one. And number two, it's got to do all the things, right? It's got to have OAuth and all the things that you're supposed to have, a single sign-on. And John's dead right. Like once someone has picked an identity provider, having 2 is often not a discussion that anyone's willing to have. And even federating them is a very touchy discussion for that people, and with good sense. Like the people's logins are the most vulnerable spot in any infrastructure. Hooking up Azure AD to Google for single sign-on, so people could like log into GCP with their Azure AD credentials. I did it twice in a week in February, and it took less than 15 minutes each time. So it's gotten so silly easy.
Right.
There's a thing you do on Azure.
One of the things I like about Google too, Jamie, is like if you are used to using Kubernetes, like the identity aspect,
it just feels right.
Users and groups, it's basically the same thing. In Google, so like the learning curve going to like Google for authorization and those things, so it's just like it's a service account. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. It's built from the same. And then the second thing I'll say, so that's incredibly easy. Like federating one cloud to the other, regardless of where your source of truth is, it is not a high barrier anymore, and everyone's got similar workflows. But second, one of the cool, because sort of the idea of Kubernetes RBAC was sort of birthed inside Google back in the day, or at least influenced by Kubernetes is very heavily influenced by the way Google's infrastructure works. You can use a thing, and this is native to GKE, but you can do a thing called workload identity, where the RBAC role in the kube cluster maps directly to a service account. So the pod is running as the service account. And then in the various data services like Cloud SQL, you can log in as an IAM, as a service account. So I can literally go from in the pod, authenticate as the service account I'm running as against the database, and not have a password anywhere.
Okay.
In the entire data flow. all of it is based off of the IAM account, the service account that the pod is running as.
Right.
Incredibly effective tool. So I don't even have to put there's no password anywhere.
Yeah.
Like that is an incredibly effective, and it takes, again, 20 minutes to set up. Not high burden. Like the demo takes 20 minutes.
It seems at some point that sounds familiar to the, like, where we had IAM roles at, our AWS server and or an entire VPC or something like that in the early days when people didn't understand this stuff and they were making mistakes. Of course, I keep seeing them, but
they still don't. I mean, I went to EC2 just out of curiosity the other day, and it was like there's 867 roles that you can apply an IAM policy to on just EC2. I was like, well, it's just,
no one knows them all.
Yeah, no. I don't think anyone can even.
Quinny Pig does.
Things by hand.
Quinny knows them all.
Yeah.
And tweets often.
Exactly.
Because I think, back in the day, like, that was a bad idea because anything could be on that server. There was often multiple things on that server. And now that we have very narrow scoped pods and containers, that seems like a better approach, especially considering the fact that if it's an environment variable password, then that password will work from anywhere and not just in that pod. And so we're now saying it's not really a password. But I see this happening too on, like, even GitHub Actions recently. I can't even remember what protocol it was. It's escaping me. I need more coffee. But you can now use GitHub Actions with the clouds without needing a password, a key essentially. And I love that we're getting towards this, passwordless future, if that ever is really going to happen.
Crossed, man.
Right. We all have already spent too many years of our lives managing passwords and API keys and stuff, and it just it sucks. All right, last question. This is a doozy because it's actually Biker, one of our regulars, coming up and saying, I need help troubleshooting Red Hat on AKS. So basically, it comes down to if you have latency coming out of a cluster, and it sounds like it's a web app, and he says even with a blank page, we're seeing 500 to 1500 millisecond lag. At what point, when you don't have access to the infrastructure, how do you troubleshoot?
Definitely.
Yeah. It's some sort of funky double encapsulation. The SDN's probably out of whack.
So what? Start with a troubleshooting container that's testing the connection closest, and then keep working your way out. Like you're outside of the cluster. You're outside of that.
Yeah, from the looks of it, it looks like it's like a DIY thing. So I would even look down at, I would go as close down to the physical infrastructure of the network as you could. Start looking at MTUs and packet sizes and that kind of stuff. Is what it's 100%, almost 100. If it's not the SDN, then it's got to be the API server. But I would look at the SDN really hard and dig as far down into it as you could.
I mean, it really could be DNS. Like a lot of those things, especially if they're hanging initially, it's those initial lookups. I think the cache is set to 0 for a lot of default, the DNS cache for a lot of those things. And then, so that's probably the biggest thing to look at. Jamie mentioned the encapsulation. That's pretty important. Networking problems can be tricky, of course, but I think MTU is a big one too, because if they, the thing with MTU is it's got to be set everywhere. So if it's only set at some places and not other, you get a lot of packet fragmentation and things like that. So
and cloud networks like that are not designed to reintegrate those packets at speed. It's not like because it's all happening in software. But I would look at the SDN. Of course, it could always be DNS because the world could always be DNS. But my guess would be the SDN's just malconfigured a little bit.
Yeah. Those are all great tips. Thank you for that. I was going to suggest a troubleshooting container, and you just run it. You start at the closest on the machine, on the pod itself, and then work your way all the way back one by one, running it in various places. And you're right. I should look up, ironically, this week. I didn't know the default DNS TTL on core DNS. It's 5 seconds because we all hate DNS and its caching in dynamic services. So that's a thing that's funny because you would assume, well, no, I just queried it and then I queried it again. It was still slow. But if it was 5 seconds and you were doing it in cluster, you had to do another lookup. Like we think of time to. I'm still like a 15-minute time to live person when it comes to DNS.
86,400, baby. 86,400.
Yeah, copy paste, and people and we've ended up, and most people don't realize this. We've ended up in a world where like a minute is long, and we have DNS caching everywhere already at the DNS level. So just it could be DNS. It's what is it? What is it we say? It's always DNS.
DNS, yeah.
Yeah, so use the IP to get around that, I guess, for the short term.
He's done some troubleshooting already. Double encapsulation of the SDN. I'll talk to our infrastructure network architect thing. Yeah, like if you're gonna have and it's more prevalent like on VMware than it would be on AWS. But I don't know enough about AWS's networking these days. I've been off in my own little weird. But they're going to encapsulate it somewhere, and then your SDN, if it's a DIY cluster, unless you're using VPC level networking, like we do in GKE, it's got to be encapsulated because it's a whole nother network. So you got 48 bytes going somewhere, and if that MTU's, if you're sending full packets and you're lopping off the header, yeah, it's going to be slow.
Spoken like a true ops professional.
like somebody with a lot of scar tissue.
That's right. That's why I always tell everybody coming into this community in the DevOps, I was like, honestly, if I were to look at you as a resume, I'm going to probably ask you, like, what's the difference between OCI layer 3 and 4? What's the difference between a switch and a router? Break down some IP subnets. All the same questions we were asking 30 years ago, because just like you were saying, Docker training's still a thing. Network training still a thing, and networking is more important now than ever because everything is networked. Back in the day, we would put everything on one machine and it wouldn't matter. So for those of you out there listening and you're new to this stuff, networking
trivia
sysadmin,
question.
Yeah.
The OCI layer mnemonic, do you know it from the top down or the bottom up?
Bottom up, I think.
I'm bottom up. Please do not throw sausage pizza away.
Yeah, bottom up. Is there a top down?
It's something about Prince somebody or Michael's in there somewhere. I forget what it is, but there's a top down one where you start.
Wikipedia will have the answer. Yeah,
always something. So I think somebody just mentioned it. Oh yeah,
Biker's just replying. Well, I know we all can't be here forever, and I really appreciate all the questions, Biker. Thank you for the tough one at the end. I always like to throw them a curveball. But thank you two for both being here, John and Jamie. Again, from their book, let's just plug that one more time. OpenShift. It's 2018, so fair warning for those of you looking for some OpenShift training. May not be the most current thing out there, and but these guys are on Twitter, so you have my permission to bug them with all of your OpenShift questions and your Google Cloud questions.
I am selling Girl Scout cookies, and I was told I'm not allowed to go home until I sell 10 boxes. So,
well, you heard it here. So
talk to me after, John. Talk to me after.
Yeah. So are you?
Girl Scout cookies.
So Cloud Level Midnight, Cloud LVL Midnight on Twitter. You can buy. I don't know if Girl Scout cookies are available on the internet, but they are now via Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
I got a link. You treat me. You want some Girl Scout cookies? I'll send you the link. So.
Right.
Oh God, that's great.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here. Their Twitter handles are below them, you all. We've got Jamie Duncan right there, at Jamie Duncan, at Cloud Level Midnight for John, and I'm Bret Fisher. And thank you all for being here. We'll be here next week. Who do we got next week? March 10th? Yes. I got Rich and Lucas on from Loft Labs to talk about virtual Kubernetes clusters. So we hit on that topic today. We'll probably be talking more about that next week.
Aren't they all virtual?
Yes, maybe. I'm a big bare metal ops fan, by the way. Oh, teaser to those of you watching. We're working on a merch store, and it's going to be 80s DevOps themed. And I got some great designers on board, and it's going to be so much fun. We're going to create some T-shirts, and I'm going to wear all of them.
Awesome. I do love a good T-shirt. I'll have to look into it.
Yeah. So again, thanks all. We'll be back here next Thursday, live every Thursday here on YouTube, and we'll have some great guests next time, just like this week. See y'all.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot.